Josh Luna with us tonight, and he's from Springfield, Missouri. I was curious, do we have any former Missouri State University graduates or college people in the room? Any Bears? We have, hey, okay, we have some Missouri State folks. So interesting, Missouri State is a Bear, UCA are Bears. I don't know, Josh, if they ever get together and play against each other, but Amy and I spent about 4 years of our married lives working at the congregation that Josh works at. And what was wild, Josh, was to think how things come full circle. Back in the early 2000s, whenever I was up here leading vacation Bible school at Springfield, Josh, you were probably one of the earliest age groups, and now you are here speaking in the adult class. And it's pretty wild. And, it's wonderful how God works in the lives of people and the lives of friendships. And I've known him all his life, but his parents have been friends of mine and Amy's for a lot longer. And Jason, his dad, he's a Gainesville fella. And but Joshua and his wife, they've been in Springfield pretty much that area all of their lives and haven't ventured far away. But Joshua was just recently graduated from Missouri State with a double major in religious studies and psychology, and he's working on completing his master's currently. And he is the college and the young adult minister at Watermill, and he's been there with them for about 3 years. Kind of neat, growing up in the congregation and now being a minister at the same congregation. It doesn't happen very often. We're glad that you have the blessing to do that. So anyway, Josh has been tasked with a lesson about what we just learned about in the drama tonight. So we'll turn it over to Josh. Give him your attention. And FYI, just another tidbit or I'll be in big trouble. Once the class is over with, approximately 7:35, 7:40, you need to go get your kids. If you have a kid in four-year-old and under groups, okay? So once the adult class is over with, their class is over with. So thank you for your help.
So am I good here?
I think you're hot.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, yeah, there we go. Hey everybody, it's great to see you. It's great to be up here. Like Michael said, for the last 3 years I've been working at Watermill, and when you work at a church, you don't often get the opportunity to be able to visit other churches. And in this case, of course, I grew up in Springfield, and so I remember coming here for YOU many times and being encouraged, and that is a trend that has not stopped tonight. It was so wonderful to see all of those young faces here and to hear all of those young voices, and to be able to sit back in a pew and just kind of witness a multi-generational congregational effort to support our young people. And so that's a really, really wonderful thing, and I'm grateful for it. I'm really excited about this opportunity to speak to you all, and I wish I could be here throughout the rest of your VBS, because Daniel is one of my favorite books. I love it very much, and I don't say that about every book of the Bible. But Daniel is one of my favorite. It's incredibly encouraging to me, and I'm excited to jump in with you. And I will warn you, though, just before we continue, because of the drama, that my PowerPoint game is not quite on par. So be prepared for a few white screens, and it might be just terrible to look at, and that's okay. Before we get started, what I want to do is to acknowledge the fact that what we're doing here tonight is somewhat strange. It's a little bit odd. Scholars tend to date the book of Daniel in between about the 5th or 6th century BC, which is about when it's being depicted, down into about 160 or so BC, which means that at the very least, the book that we have in front of us tonight is over 2,000 years old. And here we are as a group of adults. I don't know how many of us are here, but in a world that is so transfixed and so focused on newness, and in a world in which we tend to value new things, and we're continually getting better at casting off the wisdom of those older than us, much to our demise. Here we are, sitting in a room, reading a book. It's over 2,000 years old. And we are doing dramas about it, and we're dressing up as characters from the story. And we're molding our snack time after it as well. I saw the vegetarian snacks in there. Luckily, you put it on a cookie. I thought that was very merciful of you. We're basing the entire theme of our evening tonight, around this story, and it's strange, right? Because there aren't a lot of people in our world today. There aren't a lot of adults in groups like this sitting around reading like the Epic of Gilgamesh or Enuma Elish or any of these other stories that come from this time period. And so why are we doing it? And because I have the privilege of being able to speak to you at the beginning of a longer VBS, I'd like to spend some time maybe answering that question. And of course, we believe that this story is a divine and human work. There are truths here that are deep and that are inspired by God. But another reason I think that we're sitting here tonight reading this book is that when we open the book of Daniel, what we discover is not a lifeless relic from an ancient time that has nothing to do with us. In fact, when we open the book of Daniel, what we see is are stories that are blossoming with life and stories that are incredibly relevant to our current situation. And I'd like to just dive a little deeper into that tonight. What we're going to do here in a second, I'm going to read the first portion of Daniel chapter 1, and we're going to focus a lot on Daniel chapter 1 tonight because that will inform a lot of probably what you're going to be doing the rest of this week. So if you don't mind with me, let's start reading in Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge and understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. And they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Now there are a couple things here in this first little portion that I want to point out to you that I think are incredibly pertinent to us. First of all, when the exiles are coming from Babylon, and if you are a student of the Bible, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you know what chapter we're in, what chapter of Israelite history we're in. From the very beginning, from the inception of the Israelite people as a nation, God was very specific and very clear that Israel's existence as a nation was dependent upon their ability to walk in his ways and to be a light to the nations. And so we see all the way back in Deuteronomy chapters 26 through 28, we see these blessings and these curses that get brought up that Moses gives them when he says, if you will just walk in God's ways, and if you will allow him through you to take more control over his fallen world, and if you will do that, then you will be blessed and things will go well with you. But, he says, if you start going astray, if you stop acting justly and righteously, then it will be God's responsibility to allow you to be taken captive, right, to be destroyed. because the idea is that God, through Israel, is trying to bring more and more of the world in these times under his righteous rule. And we find very quickly, at various points, but especially into 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, that this doesn't work out. And so the northern kingdom of Israel is taken captive, and here Nebuchadnezzar marches on Jerusalem. He comes several times, and each time he takes some people back, and the last time he comes and destroys the temple. And as he's bringing these envoys back to Babylon, he brings them to a very interesting place. He brings them to Shinar. And what's interesting about that is that, and that's there in verse 2, he brings them back to the land of Shinar. What's interesting about that is that Shinar didn't exist in this time. This is an anachronism, is what it's called. And so to give you an idea, of course, the land was there, but it hadn't been called Shinar in hundreds of years. And so it'd be a little like if you were going on vacation in Wyoming and somebody was asking you about your vacation and you said, yeah, we went up to the Nebraska territory, right? And it's like, well, you know, the land is still up there, but it hasn't been called that for like 150 years, right? And you'd be correct, but it's also incorrect. And so why are they calling it Shinar? Well, the first place that this shows up, or one of the first places, is in Genesis chapter 11. And it reads, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had bricks for stone and bitumen and mortar. And then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" All right, name that Bible story. Yeah, the Tower of Babel. Yeah, this is the Tower of Babel. And so what this story does, is now this word, this land of Shinar, anytime it's brought up in the Old Testament, it becomes sort of a motif or a pattern. And the point is that as this is being composed, the author of Daniel is pointing out the fact that they're in Babylon, but really they're wanting to highlight the fact that this place where Daniel and his friends have been taken is a land of great pride. It's a land of great power that's been used poorly. And it is a land that in this story especially, that spits in the face of God. And what's concerning about that is that the older I get and the longer history continues, the more that sounds familiar to me. And so here they are, these Israelites, and they've been punished by their God. Their God has sort of abandoned them, and they've been dragged back to Babylon, and they're now living in this place. And the question is, how do they go along living in a place like this? Another thing that I want to point out here that'll make this relevant for us is the fact that they are given new names as well. Down in verse 6, "Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego." Now, this probably doesn't seem very relevant to you because you don't have two names, I don't think. But as we kind of, as we explore this, I think what we'll see is that this is really something that should be very relevant to us. I've given a couple examples of these. So this was a common practice to rename the people that you were bringing back from exile, and the idea was that it was sort of showing that there was a change of ownership, right? So where I come from a very small town just outside of Springfield called Stratford, and we have one grocery store, and in that grocery store parking lot, there's a cinder block building that's a Chinese food place, and that Chinese food place has changed names like 5 times in the last 10 years because it keeps getting shut down by the health department. You know those places. And the idea is that it's like, oh, we're not Jordan Inn, we're Cashew Inn, and it doesn't fool anybody because the cockroaches are still there. And that's what's happening here. They're renaming these people. And as we look at the names, I think we see something very interesting here. So I've pulled the two names from this story that we have actually a good grasp of what these names mean. And then I've pulled another example from another book of the Bible, from Esther. So Daniel, his name means God is my judge, but they rename him Belteshazzar, which means Bel protects my life, Bel being one of the gods of Babylon. And Mishael, whose name means who is like God, gets renamed servant of Nebu, which is another god of Babylon. And Hadassah, who we know as Esther, Hadassah, whose name means bride, then gets named Esther, which is sort of a cognate of Ishtar, who is the goddess of fertility and sex and war, essentially, in ancient Sumer and then Babylon and Persia, and all of that, they kind of share gods. And what's the point here? The point is that I have an idea of my identity, right, and of my purpose, but I notice that on Monday, right, say, like, go to school and everything like that my world and my environment seems to have a different idea about my identity and my purpose. Right? Does that make sense? And all of these names, like, they sort of, I don't know, there's like an expectation built in here. And these are terms that denote purpose and denote identity. And sometimes, as a Christian, I think it can feel as though we have two different names, right? That we have two different identities, and we have an idea of who we are, but then as we go into our work week, right, we notice that we're surrounded by people who have different ideas about who we are, or who we should be, or things, or what we should care about, and what we are made to be. Right? And so the question is, how do we reconcile this thing that's happening here? One last thing before we move on. I want to talk about the training here, the purpose, why they were brought to Babylon. It becomes very apparent. It comes out here in verse 3. The king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And the king assigned them a daily portion of food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Now, this is a very common practice. And the idea is that if you were a nation and you decided that you're going to go to war against another nation, you didn't just go in there and stomp on all of the cities and kill all of the people, because then, you're actually not that much more powerful than you were before, right? The land's just bigger, and you're more spread out now. Instead, what would happen is they'd come and they'd plunder and pillage and do all of that, and then they would take the best and the brightest, right? They would take the best and the brightest, and they'd bring them back to their capital, and they would teach them their ways. Right? You'd get them young, and you'd teach them their ways. And the idea was twofold. One, you could help bolster your own sort of bureaucracy and leadership, but also the plan was that you were then going to take those people who were natives of the kingdom that you now ruled over, but who had grown up learning your ways and being taught your rules and your culture, and then you would take them and put them back so that they could rule over their people, but with your interests in mind. And the reason why I think this is so important is because this is still, I think, a way that our world operates today, maybe in less direct and less explicit fashion. But I think one thing that we cannot allow is for our world to mold the leaders and future leaders of our churches. So that when we are here in our churches, we're doing it in the interest of our world. Rather, we need to create congregations that mold and shape the leaders and the future leaders of our world. Right? the idea. And you seem to be doing a fantastic job of that, just that. Teaching your children and then moving them out into the world to do good. It's a good thing. And so what this leaves us with, this sort of context for where we start our story, it leaves us with a lot of questions about how we live in a world like this, and how we live with the fact that our world has different expectations of us and different ideas about who we are and what our purpose should be and what we should be focused on and what we should care about. And how do we know the answer isn't to just like conform to our world, but we also know that the answer isn't just to like, lock the doors and keep everybody in here and just like, do this thing, and not have any sort of part in our world. And so the question I think that's going to be explored, especially tonight, but maybe even throughout your study on Daniel, is just that, how we live in our world. And that's why I love the book of Daniel. Now, I'm gonna read the rest of Daniel chapter 1 here, and we'll spend a lot of time focusing on this story before bouncing in to talk a little bit about chapter 2. But yeah, if you'll read with me in verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the king's wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who has assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. And then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants accordingly to what you see. And so he listened to them in this matter, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were actually in better appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. And so the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables, which seems like it should be a win, but it doesn't quite feel like it, right? Vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And at the end of the time, when the king had commanded they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Okay, what we see here and how we're going to approach this, we see Daniel's action, God's response, and then their sort of combined impact. So first of all, let's look at Daniel's action here. It shows up in verse 8. He decides that he's not going to be defiled about the food, right? Now, there is a vicious and long drawn-out nerd fight in biblical studies about what on earth this means. And there are several different explanations as to why Daniel and his friends would be refusing the food. It's not exactly clear, like there's a lot of things going on. And don't waste your time. There are a lot of explanations. If you're curious about it, you can ask me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but we won't bore you with that, because the biggest thing that's important here is that Daniel was motivated by his desire to please God, and that because of that, he draws a line. Right? You see that? And so whatever it is about the food that's going to defile him, it doesn't really matter, because what's happening is the same. Daniel is motivated by his faith and his love for God, and he draws a line. And this is significant for a few reasons. First of all, because Daniel lives in a world that's much like our own. And by that I mean that Daniel is expected to compartmentalize his faith. Right? You all experience that? We live in a world in which, like separation of church and state is like a thing, which is, probably a good thing maybe, but we have that precedent, and then we tend to separate church from then every other aspect of our life as well. And sometimes it feels like we can have our faith, right? But then whenever we move out into our weekday on Monday, right, like we're supposed to sort of put that back in a shoebox and put it on the shelf and live for our environment for a few days, and then we get to take it out for a little bit on Wednesday, and then we put it back, and then we wait for a little bit, and then we take it out on Sunday. But Daniel's unsatisfied with this. He's unwilling to compartmentalize his faith, and when he shows up, he's just who he is. He's just a follower of God. And that means that he's unwilling to defile himself with the food. But this is also significant because Daniel takes a great personal risk here. And you notice the response of the chief of the eunuchs. He says, essentially, hey man, I'd love to get you that food and everything that you want to not defile yourself, but if you show up weak, if you're smaller than everybody else, the king will cut my head off, right? This is the idea. And what we have to understand is that if Nebuchadnezzar is willing to behead his chief eunuch, then he's probably not above beheading the, troublemaking teenager from Judea, right? Because he won't eat the food. Okay? And so Daniel, he's not only like risking this conflict, like this head-to-head conflict, right, by rejecting this food that he's been given, but also like this is food from the king's table, right? And his job for the next 3 years is to like grow in wisdom, right, and to read the literature and to read the law and to become the sort of prototypical Babylonian so that he can serve in the king's court. So the king, he's like his boss, And have you ever noticed that like your boss's jokes are like just a little bit funnier than everybody else's jokes? You know what I mean? Yeah, and you get why? Yeah. It's not because he's funny. It's because we want to look good for the people who are in power over us, right? And here's Daniel, and he's unwilling. He is unwilling to seek advancement, right, and career opportunity at the expense of his faith. And this is significant, I think, because for me personally, one of the things that I notice in my life is that when I go through periods where I don't know how to put this, I guess, but when I go through periods of my life where I'm really sort of coming off of a spiritual high, right? Like I'm spending a lot of time in my world and in my environment, one of the things that I hear whispered in my ear, just personally, is like, if you follow God, you'll be nothing. If you follow God, you'll be a nobody. And I don't know if this is true for you. I know it's not just me, because something similar shows up in 1 Samuel chapter 15. If you remember, 1 Samuel chapter 15 is that just a heartbreaking chapter in which Saul is rejected by his God. And the idea is that God gave Saul this mission to kill all of the Amalekites and to kill Agag the king, because they had perpetrated so much evil and so much destruction that it was not safe to keep any of them alive. And so he tells Saul, I want you to go, I want you to crush the Amalekites, and I want you to kill everything. And all of the sheep and all of the stuff, and I want you to kill Agag the king. And he doesn't do that, and Samuel shows up, And you remember Saul says, oh, I've just done this great thing for God, and I've sacrificed all of the stuff. I did exactly what God said. And Samuel says, then what is the bleating of sheep that I hear? And the point is that at some point, Paul knew what God had asked him to do, but then he saw this great benefit that he could get from not doing it. Because this is a lot of plunder, this is a lot of wealth, right? This is an opportunity to make himself bigger. And he's a king, and he could kill Agag, the king, but if he doesn't kill him, then he becomes a king of kings, right? Understand? And he's so drawn in by that temptation that he falls into it, and he rejects what God asked him to do completely. And we know that this is the motivation because Samuel says to him, Saul, even though you're small in your own eyes, did I not make you king of Israel? And the idea that we see in Daniel that he's sort of throwing off, that he's willing to throw off, is the idea that if we follow God, we'll be nothing. That's like a temptation or a fear, I guess, that perpetually surfaces, I suppose, for me. But Daniel's unwilling to get ahead at the expense of his faith. And he's willing to put his entire life on the line. He says in a sort of, I think, great statement of faith, test it, Because he has confidence and he has faith that it'll work out in the end. And against all reason, too. Because keep in mind, he's just been drugged from his home. And the temple's hundreds of miles that way, And you're technically sort of being punished right now, right? God isn't here. He hasn't made an appearance yet. And Daniel, against all reason and against all hope, is willing to put his entire life on the line to serve God. I think that's significant. And most of us get this same, challenge posed to us, putting our life on the line for Christ, but at the same time, that's exactly what we have posed to us. Because when you show up at a state school, when you show up at Missouri State, your freshman year when you're 19, and you just walk on campus and you have this whole world in front of you, but you have deep faith convictions, it certainly feels like you're giving up a portion of your life, right? That you're putting a portion of your life on the line to live how God wants you to live. And there's a risk involved there. And Daniel is willing to put it all on the line to follow his God against all reason and against all hope. And I think we'd be wise to follow that. Now let's look at God's response here. In verse 9, it says, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And now this is already interesting and important because we see God moving outside of Israel and into exile, and he is responding to the way that Daniel is acting. And what's interesting here is that they are, they're exiled, right? They're exiled. And God has told them that he was going to give them up to the kings, to the king of Babylon, to the king of Assyria. And that, for this particular people, they're going to be in Babylon for 70 years. But God doesn't wait 70 years in order to respond to Daniel. Right? He's not unwilling to listen. And I think this is important because for so many of us, there are times in our life in which our sins have natural consequences. Right? This is how I like to think about this. Our sins carry natural consequences, right? And even though we may be forgiven, there's still like the practical, outcomes of our actions that we deal with. And sometimes when we are dealing with the natural consequences of our life choices and the natural consequences of our sins, as the Israelites here are doing, it can feel like God is a million miles away from us and that he'd never show up and help us. And that is absolutely incorrect. Because right here we have God stepping out of Israel and into exile, and into Daniel, who's dealing with the punishment of his ancestors, the punishment of maybe even of his own sins, because he is from this like noble, like royal class, right, that Isaiah was talking about, that was stomping on the poor and doing all of these things. And when Daniel is willing to dedicate his life to Christ at his expense, then God is willing to show up and to sort of smooth that out. He's willing to be present. And that's something we need to remember, how quickly God shows up, right, in our times of trial, and in our times of punishment, and our times of chaos, I guess, in our life, how quickly God shows up. But then God does something else that's even more baffling. In verse 17, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all the visions and dreams. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because what we noticed in Daniel's action is that Daniel was all about putting up barriers, right? He's all about setting boundaries. And he would go so far, but then he wouldn't eat the food. Okay? And what we learned from that is a principle about interacting with our world, that we need to set boundaries, right, for the way that we act and the things that we do. But then right here, what we see is God is almost pushing him further. Because he, above all of the people who are in this sort of camp with him, God causes him to excel in all learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. So in archaeology, okay, we have hundreds of what are called practice tablets. And these are the tablets that the scribes who were learning Akkadian would have written. And the idea was that you were learning the laws of Babylon, and you were learning to write in cuneiform, and there are just hundreds of them. And so Daniel and his friends, what they were likely doing in this time when they were being re-educated is they were learning Babylonian law, right? And they were learning Babylonian religion, Babylonian myth. And they were reading things like Atrahasis, which is the Babylonian flood myth. And they were reading things like Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation myth. And not only were they reading these things, and would they have been immersed in this sort of culture, but God gave them learning and skill, right? All literature and wisdom. Right? This is fascinating. And one of the issues that we have in our church, I say we. One of the issues that we have to face as a church, as a kingdom, is how we strike a balance between completely conforming to our world and then having absolutely nothing to do with our world. Because on the one hand, we know we shouldn't conform to our world. We shouldn't lose our identity and who we are. Right? But on the other hand, if we retain our identity and we have that power in our scriptures and we know who we are, but we never interact with anybody in our world, then it becomes, we're not being helpful. You know what I mean? And we're not exactly completing our full mission. And here in these two areas, in these two actions, one by God and one by Daniel, we find that balance being struck. Right? And so sometimes, and I'll just say, sometimes what we want is like a straight answer, right? How should we interact with our world, right? Like we want an answer. Who should I hang out with, right? Where should I go to school? Should I send my kids to school, right? Like we want an answer. And what we find in passages like this is that we have to, when it comes to interacting with our world, we have to execute wisdom. And we have to be able to balance these ourselves and to see the value in both. And for Daniel, he was drawing lines and making boundaries and everything like that. And just as he was doing that, God said, no, I need you. These are great, but I need you to get immersed in that culture. Right? I need you to go a little bit further. And we'll see why here now. What's the impact of these two actions when you have these two combined, like the concern for drawing boundaries and doing all of that, and the concern for being present and active and like immersed in our culture and in our world. What's the combined impact of these? Look down here in, there are a couple of places. Let's do 16. First of all, what we find is that our environment changes when we do stuff like this. The steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables, right? And so it was like this. It was Daniel drawing those lines and making those boundaries, right? And being resolved that he's not going to defile himself, and God pushing Daniel to be immersed in the culture. And what we find here at the end of chapter 1 as well is that allows him then to become one of the closest advisors to, at this point, like the most powerful man in the world, and that's where we get into chapter 2. We'll jump into chapter 2 here real quick. So we just saw our play here, our drama, and we know that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and in his dream he sees a statue, and it's a statue made out of different things, and there's a rock that comes that's not cut from human hands, and it destroys the statue, and then it turns into a mountain, and we know the explanation of that. What I want to focus on here are two things, rather. First of all, when Nebuchadnezzar starts asking his magicians and his sorcerers about the dream, it's a really funny challenge, but what he's doing is breaking from a long line of like Assyrian and Babylonian tradition. It's really interesting. So I'm writing my thesis right now on Babylonian and Israelite creation myths and their laws, and because of that I have to read a lot of Akkadian poetry, and it is terrible. It's been such a bad summer. And I will say one of my favorite, and I came across a really great inscription the other day, and it's an inscription from one of the scribes of Esarhaddon, who's a king in Assyria. And the scribe says, Esarhaddon, the great king, has asked me to tell him everything that I see in the sky that might concern his kingdom. But I mostly just tell him the good stuff, And I'm like, man, that's really human. That was like, it's like 2,600 years old. But Nebuchadnezzar isn't satisfied with this. He doesn't want like the yes man answer. And so he's really clear. He says, tell me the dream, and then I'll let you tell me the interpretation. In other words, he's concerned not with like hearing what he wants to hear, but he's concerned with hearing the truth. And I think for most people in our world, this is the case. We don't always give them that credit. But I think most people in our world want to know the truth. They don't want to hear just what they want to hear, even though we may think they do. We may just like make that blanket statement that they just want to hear what they want to hear. But I think most of the people around us want to hear the truth. And Daniel, because of the boundaries he makes, because of his decision not to defile himself and to follow God, and because of God's persistence to push him further and further into the culture, has found himself in the unique position where he is the only person in Nebuchadnezzar's life that can tell him the truth. And what's the point? I'll give you an example here. There's some of you in here, I'm sure, that work in the medical field, maybe. And if not, just like throw any other job in that. Or, it really doesn't matter. But some of you work in the medical field, and you know that language, and you know that culture, right? And you know what it's like to work 12-hour shifts, and you know what it's like to have this incredibly emotionally taxing job, and I don't. And for you, because you have been so specialized in that area, and because that's where you live, and this is the culture where you exist, there are many people in your life for whom you are the only person, maybe the only person, that can tell them the truth. And I can't do it. And some of these other people in here can't do it because they're your people, they're your context. And that's your mission field. And what that means, it's a blessing and it's also terrifying. Because on the one hand, that means that all of us in this room matter, and all of our individual ministries here matter a great deal, because there are people in our lives who depend on us for the truth, and we can't shy away from telling them the truth. On the other hand, it's very scary, because it means that we are expected to live in our world and in our cultures and to interact with the people that God has caused us to interact with in a way that leads them to Christ. And I pray that we all do that. I'm gonna end here. I think I've gone a little bit over, but if you all will just join me in prayer, and we'll kind of end our time here. Thank you so much. Our Father in heaven, God, we have been given a very difficult mission, a very special mission. All of us come from different backgrounds and live in different worlds, and we speak different languages and are immersed in different cultures. And we're grateful for that diversity in this room. We're grateful that you are a king and a God who cares about all people from all walks of life. And God, we ask that you give us all here in this room the courage and the wisdom to know where to draw boundaries, where to draw lines, what to say. Give us the right thing to say, how to act, who to talk to. All of those things that we struggle with every day, God, we ask that you, as the giver of goodness and wisdom and the revealer of all deep things, as Daniel refers to you, we ask that you give us that wisdom and that courage and that strength to move out into our world and be relevant to it, but to know who we are and to remember who we are. And to not lose hope, but to continue in strength to bring more and more of your fallen world back under your righteous rule. God, we love you so much. We're grateful that we can call on you. And we ask that you please hold our hand the rest of this week as these good people continue to study your word, and as we go back into our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.